welcome back. This tutorial video is on a Terminator from the Emperor's Shields chapter in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The Emperor's Shield is a custom chapter created by my client, so that's why you probably don't recognize the name. Anyway, what you can see that I'm doing right now is I set up a couple of perspective points. Currently it's a 2-point perspective, but that actually ends up changing a little bit. But anyway, so we're just sketching in the Terminator here on a normal layer using a fairly dark gray and the paintbrush. Looks like I'm painting at about 50% opacity. And you can see I have some reference in a little window of the Tartarus pattern Terminator armor available from Foreground. Alright, so some more sketching here and there, just trying to figure out the position of the Terminator. Is he walking? Is he more stoic? What's going on with this guy? And you can, if you're familiar with the Warhammer 40,000 universe, you'll see he has a Thunderhammer and Storm Shield, which are pretty standard Terminator gear. Now I'm using the lasso tool just to change his dimensions, and you can see I added another vanishing point. So we're working in a 3-point perspective, which is actually quite difficult. If you're the top perspective, or the top vanishing point, the pink one there, is the kind of the sky vanishing point, and ideally it's actually very high off canvas, so it's so far away that the lines are nearly parallel, the lines emanating off of it, so you don't really need it. However, in this case, I lowered the third vanishing point until it's actually on the canvas, so this adds a very dramatic angle of essentially a camera, or if you were in the scene, you'd be on your back looking up towards the sky. If it was noon, that's where the sun would be. So anyway, a little bit of a more challenging composition because of that. I had to constantly reference the perspective lines and the vanishing points to make sure everything was correctly laid out. And I'm doing some thunderhawks and explosions and trying to figure out what's going on. There wasn't a really specific request. If I remember correctly, the request was just to have it appear similar to the background of the Black Templar painting I did a while back. And that's fine, but I wanted something a little bit more interesting, and I wanted a more dynamic angle. I didn't want just this kind of straight-on look. So I wanted the very dramatic 3-point perspective here. And we're doing some fun stuff with the Terminators. We're giving them little headlamps, which are actually on the miniatures. You can see them, but they don't really put out that much light. And you can see there's the third vanishing point is going to have the brightest area. And moving the vanishing points, adjusting the perspective lines before I really commit. Everything is still very loose right now, so it's very easy just to kind of, extend a limb or change the angle of something. I almost did give up, though. I was very tempted a few times to just give up on this ridiculously difficult composition and try something simpler, but I'm really glad I stuck with it. This is a really nice portfolio piece, and if you think about your career as an artist, there are certain sort of tools you pick up along the way in the form of skills. And in this case, I think I really, if you pardon the gaming vernacular, I think I really leveled up in terms of my abilities, because this super dynamic composition is something I couldn't have attempted before, or if I did, it would have been pretty miserable. so we're trying to figure out this building. Now, one thing I will say is just because this was so complicated in terms of perspective, the building is a little bit simple. It's kind of just this monolithic rectangle, a rectangular prism, and I'm okay with that. It was just a little bit too much work to detail it in a three-point perspective, as I'm sure you can imagine, and a lot of the detail would have been lost, just because the dimensions are so extreme. The perspective is so extreme here that it's actually difficult to keep things realistic looking because your eye looks at it and says, "What is going on?" Alright, so as you can see, I'm very carefully referencing my perspective lines and adding new ones. The way I add the perspective lines, okay, listen carefully because I don't want to have to explain this. The way I currently do perspective lines is I will set up a vanishing point, and then I will just use a normal brush or the pencil tool, 100% opacity, very small brush size, 100% hardness, and just click, and then shift and click again. That's all I do. I click in the center, shift click outside of the center, and I make a straight line. That's all it is. There's another way to do it, which I haven't attempted yet, which is using smart objects, where you create this giant, pretty much giant perspective wheel with lots of spokes. And if you save it as a smart object, you can bring it into any painting you want and apply it. So I haven't tried that yet. I'd like to. I'm going to give it a shot in the near future. But that's another way to do it. As you can see now, I'm still changing the perspective on these guys because it actually wasn't correct before. Ironically, the more normal they look in terms of perspective, the less correct they are. If I had just normal guys walking at you, no real perspective effects added to them, it'd be actually incorrect compared to the rest of the scene, which is bonkers perspective. Alright, so we're sort of refining the sketch now. You can see the reference once again. And the Tartarus pattern is a fairly new release from Foreground. I think it came out this year, but it's not commonly seen. So this was good and bad. The reason it was good was it was a really cool looking armor. The reason it was bad is because it's not as easily recognizable. So if a 40k player looks at this, they're going to say, "What the hell is that guy wearing?" unless they're familiar with the entire Foreground line. Also, I've painted Terminator armor of the normal variant a lot. I haven't painted Tartarus pattern ever, so it was a little bit challenging because, believe it or not, it's actually pretty difficult to learn how to paint a Space Marine's power armor. There's a lot of little nuances and details, and you have to figure out how it actually works. How the plates overlap, where the servos go, where the joints are, how high can he lift his arm with those giant pauldrons they wear, all types of stuff. Can a Space Marine touch his hands behind his back? Can a Space Marine touch his fingers above his head, etc. There are some positions a Space Marine simply cannot do because their armor won't allow them to. And with Terminator armor, it gets extremely more limiting. A Terminator can really lift his arms almost 180 degrees outwards. Like in a T-pose, they can almost do it. I don't think they can quite do it. And they rotate along the body's axis. So anyway, stuff to figure out, and geometry of the armor itself is a little bit different. This armor has some kind of molded, sculpted contours to it, whereas the traditional armor is very bulky and kind of blocky. Anyway, so the client requested Tartarus pattern armor in the color scheme of his original chapter, and he wanted the guy to have a thunder hammer, and you can see the reference he provided, which was very nice. It's sort of this shield-shaped hammer with wings, and he had a specific shield in mind that he wanted the guy to be carrying. And there had to be a robe, kind of like similar to the Dark Angels, which is another Space Marine chapter. And those are really the primary constraints. As far as the background, I was pretty open to interpretation. I just did a little bit of the, I think it was a Control J, select Control J and then Transform tool to change the perspective of the helmet and the collar and gorge it. And here I'm shading. I'm just using a normal layer here with a brush, 40%, 100% round, 40% opacity, 100% round. That's really all I'm doing. I know I get a lot of questions asking about, I'm not really sure I understand the question. They say like, how are you doing that? And I'll tell you exactly what brushes I'm using, but it doesn't really seem to answer the question. Also, I did get a specific request to explain what layer types I'm using when I'm coloring, so I will do that because apparently it's not clear. And it's hard to follow when everything's sped up 100%. So I understand that, but for all this monochrome, it's really normal layers. Occasionally darken and lighten, but really it's just normal layers. Okay, so more detail work. Not going too crazy yet, just trying to get things to look right. Oh, this thing was a pain. I hate doing the Aquillas on the chest. They're so hard to get right in perspective. They're these very complicated 3D shapes, and they have to wrap around and lay flat on the armor, or excuse me, lie flat on the armor. And that's difficult because the armors are the chest plates are generally contoured. They're sort of barrelly or cylindrically shaped, and that can be difficult to do when you do something that's complicated like eagle wings or whatever. Okay. Further refining of the shapes using highlights and shadow. There's a lot of light coming on. There's a primary light source overhead, and then there's secondary light sources cast from the spotlights on his shoulders, and there's a bounce from underneath, so there's a lot of lighting to consider. And here's some further blocking using normal layers. And you can see when I blend, I use a 20% opacity brush. I rarely, very, very rarely use the blur tool. I like to just eyedropper and blend with a very low opacity brush. I think it has a way better effect and looks less digital. And I don't know. I don't really like the smudge tool or the blur tool. I have very, very few uses for it. Its primary use nowadays for me is really just kind of loosening smoke. If I'm doing like smoke trails from a rocket or a ship or something, it's okay for that, but that's really it. Okay, so here we're adding the belt buckle. Gotta make sure it's the right volume and right light facings. We're still using the normal brush, normal layer, normal brush. Looks like an 80% opacity. And when in doubt, use the lasso tool and resize it. Mix it up with transform. And back to the tabard, I guess. The robe portion of the armor. Now the legs were a little bit difficult. Just figuring out kind of the volume of them and where the light would hit them. A little bit difficult because they are a little bit, they're sort of tapered cylinders, so like a segmented cone sort of. And you want to be able to reflect the fact that this armor is like kind of polished steel, so it's reflective. So it's going to have a very high specular highlight. What that means is the highlighting is going to be very strong. It's not going to be diffuse or kind of blended out. It's going to be very intense. The more polished something is, the more reflective something is, the harder and brighter the specular highlight will be. The more kind of textured or dull something is, the more diffuse the specular highlight will be. Actually, a very kind of soft, like cloth, for example, shouldn't have a specular highlight unless it's, you know, made of some really weird material or something. But like wool or whatever, it will have no specular highlight on it. Unless it's wet, that's the only exception. Things that are wet get their own specular highlights because water is very reflective. Alright, so more detail work. Doing the cloth here. The cloth is always difficult. I don't have I don't know. It's difficult to do, so I tend to, if I don't have reference available, I'll just kind of fudge it. I'll try to figure out where things would fall and just be really bold with it, and that generally tends to work out. Oh, I almost forgot. There's another light source, which is the Thunderhammer is going to be glowing with electricity and lightning, so that's going to be casting blue highlights nearby. And here we go, fixing perspective. As you can tell, it's actually difficult to paint in a perspective that extreme. Unless you've been training for it, your mind is just, it's not going to understand what's going on very well. It's going to want to draw things as you normally would, or normally perceive them. So as you can see, every once in a while I'll have to check everything and then sometimes tweak the entire image using a transform tool. And for those who are curious, the way that I can distort things using the transform tool, because if you just hit Control T, transform, you can only scale horizontally, vertically, or I guess, I don't remember what the name of it is, but uniformly, I guess would be the term. If you want to just sort of distort and move one corner, I think it's either hit Control or Alt and then click on that corner and move it around. Try it out. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think it's Control, but yeah, hold down Control and then click on the corner, and you can freely move each corner and distort the image. It's very useful for matching perspective. Alright, so doing some detailing on the bracers here. The gauntlet and the brace. And we're just keeping it loose, really. I found a lot of time the trick to doing hands right is to go pretty minimal with them. Unless it's in the foreground, then you kind of have to work on it. But if you can help it, I mean, because hands can be a really big time sink. Now, I'm not saying you should avoid doing hands. Hands are really important. Hands and faces are the most important parts of a human figure, or a humanoid figure. So if they are visible, you have to spend a lot of time on them. However, in a case like this, where you sort of have it, partially obscured by the brace and it's sort of grasping an item, it's easier to just sort of hint at where the hand is and how it's positioned rather than go into a lot of detail. And you can see here I'm trying to figure out the perspective once again, and I'm trying to fix the lighting on this gateway. And I'm just using the lasso tool with my perspective lines that I've created for reference. Pretty simple. Just got to make sure that each plane is the right lighting, or has the lighting and shadow applied to it. So you can see my reference here is that shield in the upper left, and it's sort of a more traditional shield shape. Storm shields in Warhammer are generally these giant Maltese crosses. So this is more of a traditional form, so I had to make that be reflected. So the way to do that was to alter the geometry and hint at the volume using shading and highlights. And knowing me, you can see that I'm instantly going in and detailing little chips of paint and dents and divots and scrapes along the surface. And we're doing some bolts now on the frame. And fleshing out the Thunderhammer a bit. Ironically, when I play, or I guess coincidentally rather than ironically, my Space Marine army has a lot of these guys: Thunderhammer, Storm Shield, Terminators. On a personal note, I'm very excited for the new Chaos Codex to be coming out. I believe it's being announced on the 23rd. I could be wrong, but for all those people who have no idea about anything Warhammer and don't care, you can just look at what I'm doing instead of listening for a second. But anyway, so yeah, I'm doing the Thunderhammer now. It was a really interesting, complex shape, so it was fun to paint. And it's highly detailed, as you can see. There's sort of these feathers that are etched in, or possibly sculpted in. So it was definitely challenging. And it's got this nice aquiline feature to it. And I tried adding some little studs. Didn't look quite right, so they don't stick around. Okay, now we're doing a giant winged skull, because that's what you do when you paint Warhammer 40k stuff. I was looking at some of the art from my favorite Warhammer artists, and in my opinion, the person who draws or paints skulls best is Adrian Smith. He has this very distinctive style when he paints them. I simply love it. I don't want to copy it, but I do always draw inspiration from him. His skulls especially are just really great. They're not so over stylized that they look cartoony, but they have certain elements tweaked so they look just menacing. For example, he tends to do the eyebrow and brow line very straight, whereas it's actually a little bit curved. The orbits and the eye sockets are more circular than that in reality, but it's just a really nice kind of grim looking skull. As you can see, I'm doing a little bit of drop shadow here, just because I'm lazy, and it saves time. And we're picking out some details of a custom ivy brush, or laurel brush, I'm sorry. Just to make it a little bit more our own. As I've said, and I say in most videos, using custom brushes is great. It's a great way to save time, it's fast, but if you're going to use them, just hide the fact that you use them a little bit. Do something to make it less obvious. And we're adding a large piece of parchment underneath this. This was actually a little bit difficult for me to figure out because the laurel, I think, is supposed to be made of metal, like sculpted, and so is the skull and the wings, but the parchment's actually made of parchment. It's not just a representative piece of metal that looks nice. It's actual stapled on or nailed on scroll. So I guess underneath the skull, there's sort of like a big buffalo clip or binder clip to hold the piece of paper there, with the bolts also helping, I guess. I don't know. Here I'm doing some little scrawled writing. Writing is really fun on parchment because parchment moves around, so you have to kind of adapt the angle you're working at to make it match the surface. Fun stuff. Alright, so here we are, adding some shadow. So what's really distracting me right now is whenever I watch one of these tutorials or one of my recordings, I can't help but remember what I was doing when I was working. So I think I was watching Tequila Sunrise at this scene, and then earlier I was watching Shooter. I know, totally random, but Netflix only has so many options that I haven't seen before. And yeah, right now we're doing the Crux Terminatus, which is the sort of sacred emblem. And the client supplied an image or a reference image of what he wanted his to look like. It's sort of non-standard pattern. So I did my best to incorporate that. And we get to paint more skulls at interesting angles. Because if you paint Warhammer art, you're going to paint a lot of skulls. And that was the warp tool. Great stuff, really fun to use and quick. I use it quite a bit if I paint something and then I realize it's a little bit off. And it's also why I do things on separate layers. For all those layer haters out there, have fun using the warp tool or any of those other tools. If you're just painting on one layer, it's not going to work. Sorry. Alright. Crux Terminatus all over the shoulder. And the other shoulder, well, there's supposed to be a shield with some angel wings, but because of the angle you're seeing it from, you're really only gonna get to see the edge of the angel wings, so that's all that's visible. And I randomly decided that the inside of the wings should be hollow-ish, so. Alright, so the client requested that the armor be etched. Now, that's pretty common in Warhammer 40k to have details on your armor and little whatever doodads. But he was, as you can see in the reference picture there, it is completely etched. Like every inch of this armor is supposed to be scroll work and little etchings and carvings and crazy stuff. So there was a lot to do. I decided the best way to do it was to cheat and use drop shadows to help make them kind of pop a little bit, as you can see. And then using a mask, I just go in and soften them. The really bright areas and the really dark areas don't have as strong textures, so just mask those out a little bit. we have to start the etching on the gorget here, which was a little bit difficult because it's a wraparound surface. It's a non-linear surface. Another quick trick for hinting at texture is to just highlight certain parts of it. It's very fast, and it makes the viewer think that there's a lot more work that it went into it than actually did. Except here on the shield, there was a lot of work. There's really no way to spin it. This took a long time. Yep, lots of freehand. And then I tried to duplicate it, but it didn't really line up right, so yay, I get to do it again. And it is not symmetrical, sorry. Not worth the time. If it had to be symmetrical, I would have done it differently. I would have painted the shield separately and then warped it in later. But since it didn't really matter that much, they are not symmetrical. Or the facings of the shield are not symmetrical. Pretty cool, right? Keep it nice and subtle. Alright, so now we're doing some lightning. Freehand. Just using normal layers. Like you do. I usually don't do lightning until the render phase, but this seemed like a lot of fun. And lately I've been really polishing out my monochromes before they're done. What I just did there very quickly was I applied a mask, the purpose of which was that the further away you get from the Thunderhammer, the more faint the lightning gets, and the easiest way to do that is just to use a mask. Just paint the lightning as you would normally, and then mask it out. And yes, I love masks. I use them all the time for everything. I probably use them a little bit too much, but it works for me, and that's all that really matters. Okay, so this is where things get weird. So I had an idea that rather than just be a basilica or a cathedral or something in the background, it would actually be a chaos portal of some kind. Because really, who doesn't like chaos portals? So my favorite of the chaos gods has always been Slaanesh. I don't know, I've been playing Warhammers for a very long time now, and Slaanesh was my first fantasy army, Warhammer fantasy army. I actually don't have any 40k Slaanesh guys yet. I'm waiting for the new codex to come out and make sure that there's no new models or anything before I start working on them. But Slaanesh has always appealed to me the most. For those who don't know, Slaanesh is this, I would say, chaos god of kind of decadence and overindulgence, other fun things. But he's the most disturbing, really. The chaos gods are these large entities who occupy the immaterium, which is really a kind of tangent universe to our own reality. It's always there. It's sort of thinly veiled behind reality, and occasionally the barrier between the warp or the ethereum, or the immaterium as it's known. There's a bunch of different names for it: the ether, the immaterium, the warp, etc. Sometimes the barriers between real space and the warp thin, and demons and entities from that plane of existence can leak through. And Slaanesh is one of the four greater entities there, and he's so powerful he's considered a god. So Slaanesh loves things that are pink and garish colors and loud noises and tentacles and all types of nasty stuff. So I thought it'd be kind of cool if this Terminator was just sort of wading through this patch of tentacles that were all sort of grasping at him, and he was just overpowering them, kind of not really paying attention. So they are desperately trying to interact with him, and he has no desire whatsoever to have anything to do with them. Also, it's just very, I don't know, very fluffy. It seems right for Slaanesh to have this sort of warp portal that's just spilling out tides of writhing tentacles and nasty, gross stuff. For those who are interested, the other chaos gods are Khorne, spelled Khorne, not Corne. Though there is a joke about that in Adventure Time, which I found particularly hilarious, but I'm not sure how many other people caught. Um, but Khorne is a very powerful. He's actually the most powerful Chaos God. He's the god of bloodshed, warfare, and martial prowess. So his stuff tends to be sort of brutish and carry axes. And their whole purpose is to spill blood and collect skulls. Then the other Chaos Gods are Tzeentch, which is spelled Tzeen Tch. So have fun pronouncing that. And he is the god of change and plotting and whatnot, sorcery as well. And his agents are usually kind of these constantly mutating things or bird type deals, lots of rainbow colors. And lastly, we have Nurgle, who is also known as Grandfather Nurgle, who is the god of decay, death, disease, and depression. So lots of D words. But his followers are usually kind of bloated and noxious and plague-ridden, covered in sores and buboes. And they are inured to pain, but they are very unsightly and rotting and disgusting. So he has lots of flies and pus and nastiness. So I like Slaanesh best. Maybe it's just me. Slaanesh is also the god of artists and perfectionists, so it tends to resonate well with me personally. But anyway, back to describing what I'm actually doing. So what I'm doing is, rather than really go into a lot of detail, though I'm sure some of you consider this a lot of detail, I'm just going in and I'm doing these little kind of ridges and suckers and bumps and whatnot on the tentacles using a highlight, just to sort of hint that they have lots going on. I could have spent a lot more time, I imagine, on these, but I think the effect is a lot stronger when they're sort of just, hinted at, rather than ultimately over-rendered. Oh, here's a fun part. So, like I was saying before, a really cool way to show off textures is to highlight those textures once they've been painted on. And the way you do that is you just imagine where the light source is, and then you just sort of pick out textures within that light source, the strongest part of the light as it hits the surface of the object. So here it's on these vambraces, these giant shin guards. So the narrow margin where the light hits it most directly, the textures are highlighted, just kind of picked out, and the rest is left in shadow. It's really cool. I really enjoy doing texture work like that freehand. And here I'm doing some similar stuff, just sort of, it looks like a kind of rough surfaced skull, kind of like it was more carved than cast. And remembering where the light source is coming from, I'm highlighting everything. And doing some more highlights here and there. The key to doing metal, as I've talked about in the past, at least highly reflective metal, is to remember to keep all your light sources in mind when you're working. So as you can see on the left, on the left of the Terminator, right underneath his shoulder pad, there's sort of this large circular area. Notice how you have light bouncing off of the chest, you have the overhead light, you have some shadows, and it makes it look more believable and credible as metal. Highly polished metal is really just a mirror applied to a 3D surface. And the tentacles get some further attention and highlights. The way I highlighted these is very much inspired by Adrian Smith. Once again, I can't stop mentioning it because I love his work so much. It's been very formulative for me, very inspiring. So the way I'm doing it is sort of how you would see it in some of his work, kind of this hard highlights used to hint at form rather than actually go into a lot of detail. And here I'm just adding some shadows and refining the edges of these tentacles as they writhe and grasp at the Terminator. fun fact for those who don't know, the other name for Terminator armor is Tactical Dreadnought armor. Just some more 40k lore for anyone who is interested. And here's some more lightning. I want to try out this sort of thunderbolt type deal coming off the Thunderhammer. It was cool, but it was a little bit too pronounced and stylized for me, so I ended up masking it out a little bit. And here I decided that we're going to have a very strong light source at the vanishing point. We have already hinted at that with the rest of the shading and highlighting in the painting, but we hadn't really actually confirmed it, so time to set it up. Here I'm doing some purity seals. Purity seals are patches of parchment, long strips of parchment that are usually covered in writing and scrawled oaths and whatnot, and they are affixed to the armor of Space Marines using wax seals. That's why it's called a purity seal. They're really cool. They're super fluffy. Most Space Marines have at least one of them on their armor at all times. And they're something you need to learn how to do if you want to do 40k art. It's just, they're gonna happen. The best way I found to paint them is to paint them in a single block color. Make sure I have them exactly how I want them to look spatially, and then I use I think it's lock pixels or whatever. You can see it at the top of the layers menu. There's a lock, the first one. I think it's called lock pixels. Essentially what happens is you can only paint on the area of that layer. You can't paint off of it, and if you erase, it will paint using your secondary color on your palette. The reason you can do that is it's really good for highlighting things that are really narrow or you don't want to give an edge to. So, for example, the parchment is really just sort of like a two-dimensional. It's paper. It's very thin. And if you try to highlight that by hand, you're gonna accidentally thicken it out just because you can't paint that accurately. So if you use the lock pixel tool or layer mode, then you can just freehand the shadows and highlights onto the parchment. So that's what I like to do. And here you can see I'm doing all the little scrawled writing. Just a layer, normal layer, underneath the highlight layer. And you can also see afterwards I erase it out a little bit. The areas that are in shadow or are more strongly lit will have less scrawled writing showing. And lastly, you can see here I'm using a mask to just sort of put some tears and wear into the purity seals. Okay, time for some fun stuff, doing some more lighting, some of these secondary light sources using overlay layers. I like doing headlamps and flashlights and headlights because you can do some fun stuff with them. You know, the more kind of detritus and dust is in the atmosphere, the more distinct the beam will be. And what's really fun to paint is smoke crossing in front of the light. You can do some fun stuff with that. Kind of these rivulets of light and shadow. And doing some quick little kind of rosary type beads. You'll notice there's a little bit of a pink tinge there. The reason that happened was that I was sampling, and my eyedropper tool was sampling like 3x3 pixels rather than 1x1 pixel, and it approximated some of the pink from the perspective lines that I was using into it. So that's why there's a little bit of a pink blotch there. Okay, so we're doing some clouds now. Keeping all the clouds in perspective is lots of fun. Kind of makes this long chambered effect, like there's a portal or a sun at the center of this long column of smoke, sort of the eye of the storm. And it's really cool, so it's directly over the warp portal, so it's sort of like, I don't know, power source or something. I'll let you fill in the story yourself, but I like the idea. And just painting in some clouds, just using the round brush, not using any special brushes here. All it is just the round brush, normal layers. It's like 50% opacity. And now I'm adding some more kind of tentacles. The way I'm painting them is I'm just sort of highlighting, just to hint that there's kind of this bed of tentacles coming out of this gateway. And as you can see now, rather than do highlights, I hint at the shadows of them, because they wouldn't have a direct light source if they're coming out of this dark passage. Makes sense, right? Pretty sneaky. Okay, so now I am adding some shadow to the gate. Just a little bit, just to hint that it's sort of darker in there. And I thought it'd be cool. This is sort of very Lovecraftian, but there's this concrete object. There's this building with a door, and through the doorway, rather than being the inside of the building, there's just a star field. Like, where the hell does this gate go to? Probably somewhere you don't want to go. Somewhere saturated with eternal night or some other horrifying concept. What I'm doing here is I'm once again fixing the perspective of the building. Just be really careful when you're doing this really dynamic 3-point perspective, because a little bit off looks really, really weird, and even the most untrained casual observer will say, that doesn't look right. Creating some more radiating perspective lines here to help me figure out where the bricks on the surface are going to go. And I'm using a mask to paint out these lines so they don't extend all over everything and ruin the picture. Okay, sweet. So we've got this nice surface now. And you can see I made some more radiating lines coming off the second perspective point. Or, I don't know why I keep calling it perspective point. Second vanishing point. And I have these match up with the bricks on the other side, so it looks like, it looks like it's a brick building. If you don't have your lines match up, it's going to look wrong, and it's not going to work. If your lines don't match up from your two perspective points, your two vanishing points, you need to do it again. Otherwise, the building, it doesn't make sense. Masonry is very uniform, and it's a very good way to indicate scale and perspective. And I'm just painting in some background here between these legs where the tentacles are. Ugh, tentacles are creepy, right? Am I wrong? Maybe it's just me, but I don't like them. They're delicious, though. Don't get me wrong. I love grilled octopus and calamari and all that good stuff. Delicious. Oh, so here's the fun part. So I needed a large custom shape. I wanted a chaotic kind of rune to symbolize Slaanesh with some kind of other chaotic things going on. Kind of a composite chaos icon. So I've got the basic shape of Slaanesh, the Slaaneshi symbol, which is this circle. It's sort of like this twisted female symbol where you have a circle with a line coming off it, and then this large half moon, and then a second half moon facing the other direction. And then as you can see, I'm adding some more spokes to the larger circle, which is the traditional symbol for chaos, which is a 8-pointed star. So I made this large custom image using 100% opacity brushes on a white background. The reason being, and this is a very large image, by the way, this is 300 dpi, 2500 by 2500. And the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to define it as a custom brush preset. And now, as you can see, I'm just transforming the brush with one click onto the facade of the building. And now I have this giant, awesome chaos symbol in perfect perspective. Also, you'll notice I'm using a drop shadow on it and some masks. The drop shadow is to help establish that it's a 3D object in real space. The masks are to help add aerial perspective. And now I can go in with some new layers and paint some highlights to further enforce the idea that this is an actual 3D object, not something painted onto the building. By adding these kind of rim lights and these extremely high spec highlights, you can tell that it's metal and then has a strong overhead light source, which would be this giant nexus floating above it. This was fun and challenging. It was challenging because it's difficult to keep all your geometry straight in your head. This is a fairly complex item, and it has some embossed features. Some of it's a little bit more flat, some of it's more embossed, some of it has ridges, etc. As you can see, this is difficult to keep straight, but I think it's worth the effort because you get this really cool geometric shape without doing too much work. So there we go with that. And you can see I'm adding some kind of dripping ichor coming off of this chaos symbol using perspective lines for reference. And what was kind of also cool is I had the ichor kind of dribble on top of the bricks as well as sheet down the side, and I had little highlights, little speck highlights to make you think, oh, that stuff's slimy and shiny. Right now I'm doing this large ship that's in low orbit. The client requested that this ship, which is from I actually don't have the name of the novel off the top of my head, but it's essentially this ship that carries the Lost and the Damned, which are this legendary Space Marine chapter that's kind of mythological. They're not really totally believed in by the forces of the Imperium, who they serve, ironically. But they occasionally will show up, and they're sort of these spectral Space Marines that are constantly wreathed in ghostly fire, and they have a lot of skull and bone decorations on them. And I guess they use this giant ship to get around. I'm not familiar with it before I did this. I wasn't familiar with it before I did this painting, but it was kind of a cool design. It's these the Imperial Aquila, which is the symbol for the Imperium in Warhammer 40k, is this two-headed eagle. And the ship is sort of described as being two of these Aquilas, so 4 heads and 4 wings, kind of smushed together with a big cannon in between them. So definitely an interesting ship design, and interesting stuff to work on, for sure. And it's supposed to be enormous, which is why I'm keeping it in so much aerial perspective, so much atmospheric perspective, and just sort of keeping it simple shapes. The idea being that any of the real details you wouldn't be able to make out from that distance. Alright. So I decided that that space was a little bit empty compositionally, too much negative space, kind of distracting. So I added a cape and a couple more purity seals here to just sort of give it something, but I think it worked out fine. He's got this tattered cloak and these purity seals off the back of his pauldron there. Fun stuff. And you can see all my various vanishing points in there, perspective lines. So for those who don't know, the Chaos Gods are pretty evil to an extent. I mean, on a small scale, they're not terribly evil, but they tend to want to dominate the real universe versus their own sort of second universe. And the way they do that is by harvesting souls and whatnot. So I have these kind of poor saps who have been nailed to the side of the building and are hanging down. They're really nothing more than skeletons. And also, of course, I decided to cut out the center of that giant chaos icon and make it to a big gaping maw with several tongues coming out, because that's how chaos rolls. Pretty much chaos is supposed to be the most horrifying thing you can imagine. It's just sort of this abominable, nameless horror that will eventually consume the universe, and everyone who's alive in it, unless they're a worshiper of chaos, is doing everything they can to stop it. Chaos also has a way of converting people to its cause without them knowing, sort of subtly forcing their hand or making them think that what they're doing is the right way to battle chaos when in fact it's strengthening it. A good example of this is the legions of Khorne will kind of fall upon a world and siege it and start committing atrocities, and people rush out to battle them. So great, you gotta kill them to stop them. But the problem is that every soul released in battle through murder or bloodshed actually feeds the blood god Khorne. So you can't really fight him by fighting him, if that makes sense. So here we have these poor guys. And sometimes they're not full guys, they're missing lower halves, or they've been eaten or munched on or something. And I thought that the building was still a little bit too blank. A lot of the time Slaanesh... Oh, this is not fun. Wow, I'll interrupt myself here. I'm doing some more 3-point perspective stuff here. It was a little bit off, so I had to fix it. But anyway, a lot of the times when you read the lore of Warhammer 40k, they talk about how things that are dedicated to Slaanesh tend to be painful to look at. They're like overly wrought with carvings, or they have really garish colors, or you look at the Chaos Rune and it hurts your eyes because it's so disturbing or unnatural. So I thought it'd be cool to have the building just be totally covered in these little scrawled carvings, and I did. There they are. And I used a couple filters just to make them look less like brushwork and more like carved relief. Nothing really that big. I think I used like reticulation or some hash strokes or something. I don't know. They weren't really necessary. They didn't do a lot. I also added noise, I think. Just pixelated them a little bit. But, yep. Did them in perspective internally and externally on the structure. And I use a mask to make sure that the further away they get from the light source, the less visible they become. Because that's how details work. The further you are away from them, the harder it is to see them. The less well lit they are, the harder they are to make out, etc., etc. And when in doubt with chaos, add spikes. So this building's got some fun kind of spikes on top. It's kind of crowned with these nasty pointy barbs, which are all in 3-point perspective. Okay, so if you've seen my other videos, especially the Necron Overlord video, you'll know that sometimes it's easier to just bring in photos of minis and then convert them to a form that's usable. In this case, I wanted some Thunderhawk gunships, which are these large, really cool Space Marine. I guess they're technically spaceships, but they can enter the atmosphere and leave as well. But they're usually used for troop transport and support. So I just grabbed a picture of it off the Forge World website, inverted it, desaturated it, lowered the contrast, and that's it. Just kind of used them for their shapes, and then highlighted and shaded them to give them more volume. And it's a good way to make sure that your painting is on model, because it's going to be on model if you copy and import the miniature or photograph of the miniature. So when I'm doing little stuff like that, I will tend to do that because it's just way easier to get everything looking right if you just copy the miniature straight up. Of course, like I said, make it your own, highlight it, shade it, desaturate it, do whatever you want, repaint it, but don't take a photo and then literally just copy and paste the photo in. Do some work on it. But anyway, so here I'm adding some missile contrails and heavy bolter tracer fire and all types of fun stuff, as well as the plumes of flame coming out of the exhausts. And making sure everything's in the perspective of the lower vanishing point. And now we're going to make this light source really angry looking. It's going to look like a kind of angry hurricane or tornado. What I just did was I used a curves adjustment layer just to boost the contrast a little bit before coloring. And I am using normal layers inside of a group with color layer blend mode set. I'll repeat, I'm using normal layers in a group with color blend mode set. I am painting these on top of my monochrome painting, and that is how I'm coloring. I am not coloring directly. What I'm doing is I'm filling layers in and then painting using a mask. That way I don't have to resample or keep a palette off screen. I can just say, okay, I've got all my colors. If I want to take them out, I paint in black. If I want to add them in, I paint in white. And if I want to universally change a color, I just select the actual layer rather than the mask, and I use the hue saturation slider. That's how I color. And you can see I'm doing it right here. Just changing the gold to be a little bit less intense. Coloring some tentacles now. As you can see, I'm just using a mask. Yep, masks are the best. I have found infinite uses for them. I would like to eventually start being able to paint directly with color, but right now I like to perfect things in monochrome first before I start throwing color in. It's just how I'm most comfortable doing it that way. But eventually I'd like to be able to just sort of start with a kind of neutral canvas and then just sort of paint right in color. But I'm not sure if that's going to happen anytime soon. I'm really comfortable with my current system. So we're doing the armor now. The armor is going to be a polished steel. It's going to be metallic. But just for the sake of figuring out where it is on the canvas, I'm just using this sort of light blue color as a placeholder. The way to paint metal really is to put all the color into the highlights and reflective surfaces. You can't kind of uniformly paint metal. You can give it a tint, like for example, copper is this sort of reddish color, sort of reddish orange, and bronze is a little bit more yellowy orange. Steel tends to be sort of bluish. Iron is a little bit reddish. But for a very high polished sort of chrome effect, it doesn't have any nascent colors. It's going to just sort of take the inherit colors. It's gonna grab its surroundings, and that's where it's gonna get its color from. All right, so we're painting the colors of the tabard now. Remember, we're using normal layers in a group with the color blend mode applied, and we're coloring using masks. Part of the difficulty I have with coloring is it's a lot of faith. Right now, the painting does not look good at all. Coloring is a sort of difficult process for me because I have to trust that it's going to look okay in the end. What I did there to sort of help myself was I threw an overlay layer. As you can see, it's labeled there. I duplicated the monochrome. I pasted it on top of the folder labeled color, which is where all the colors are, the normal layers with the color blend mode. And I set that monochrome to overlay. The reason I did that was that it helps to kind of boost the contrast. So now we're doing some gold, yellow gold. of trim work to be done. Gold is a very common decorative element on Space Marine armor, especially metallic Space Marine armor. Sometimes Space Marines will have painted armor, so I don't know, Ultramarines are ultramarine blue color, Salamanders are sort of this greenish color, Crimson Fists are a navy blue, Iron Hands are black, etc., etc. And then they'll paint the rims of their armor. So, for example, Ultramarines, depending on their chapter, will have. I'm sorry, chapter. Listen to me. Depending on their company, will have a painted trim on their pauldrons. So the second company, I believe, is gold or yellow, which is the most commonly shown one. But if you have a metallic army like this one, they generally tend to use a gold trim. Gold or inversely, you can have gold armor with a silver trim or whatever, some variant of metal. Now we're doing some parchment, and I'm going to guess that we're going to be coloring the seals after this, the little wax seals. I've been practicing a lot doing seals. They're made of wax, which is a little bit more difficult to paint because it's highly reflective, glossy, but it's not really that dense in terms of permitting light through. It's not opaque. It has some subsurface scattering. Subsurface scattering, by the way, is certain materials will allow light to come in and then bounce out again. A good example of this is if you hold a flashlight in your mouth, you'll be able to see the flashlight glow through. Your cheeks will be red. Or if you shine a flashlight through your fingertips, you can see the bone underneath, stuff like that. A lot of food tends to have it because it's organically based. Metal does not have subsurface scattering. Plastic very rarely does. It can have some. Rubber tends to have more than plastic. Cloth generally doesn't. It allows some light to go through, but it's not truly subsurface scattering. But it's a really neat sort of thing to do if you can pull it off. And I like to use it on my wax because wax definitely allows for subsurface scattering. It's sort of gem-like. And there are the purity seals. So right now they look like lollipops. So that's a little bit too bright, too saturated of a red. It's going to get fixed in a second. But you get the idea. You can see how the light sort of bounces through. And here I'm doing the lightning, which is a lovely blue color. And we're doing some lovely gore dripping down from the chaos icon and the various orifices of these poor guys. In the end, I ended up putting it as a multiply layer on top of this folder. The reason I did that was within the folder, everything's only color. It doesn't affect the brightness, so the red wasn't showing up very well. It looks more like a cherry red, like someone spilt strawberry syrup on them, versus this sort of dark, thick, bloody red. So I tend to use multiply layers when I'm painting blood onto things. And we're doing the Thunderhawks now. They're also going to be that bluish color. But they have to be a little bit less saturated. The further away they get, the more atmosphere is between us and them, the less saturated they become, the more they kind of blend into their surroundings. In this case, we have a warm pinkish red sky, so they become more reddish the further away they get from the viewer. And we get to paint some little missiles and contrails and fun stuff. And this Legion of the Damned ship is supposed to be wreathed in flame, so we're just sort of hinting that it's got this distant fire on it. And it too is not completely red. It's large and it's far away, but it's not completely blending into the background. And we're trying to make the sky look really angry and unnatural. And I'm using a curve adjustment layer again, just to sort of fiddle with it, figure out what I can push and pull out. What I'm doing now is I'm using, you'll see there's some overlay layers, or they're gone now, but overlay with, if you go to image, adjustments, gradient map, I think I talked about some of my other tutorials, you can apply colors to certain value ranges in your monochrome. And it's really good for tinting your shadows and your highlights, so I like to use it sometimes. What I'm doing now is I'm just going in and I'm tinting the tentacles so they have some variation, so they're not just all this consistent color. Some are a little bit more purple, some are more pink, some are more blue, some have a little bit of a yellow tinge, etc. Now I'm using a color dodge layer, so we're officially into the render stage. I'm using a blue color dodge, and as you can see, I realized that I messed up because I'm painting directly instead of using a mask. So I convert that to a mask and then soften it up a little bit. But yes, I'm using this bluish color for a color dodge, and that represents the localized light source of the Thunderhammer, which is glowing with this violent blue. And it's illuminating nearby items and highly reflective items, but not far away items. So some of the closer tentacles and some of the armor have it. Now we're doing a bounce light. The bounce light is pinkish to reflect the tentacles underneath because that's their primary color. Not to mention the fact that the light source is sort of warm, so it would bounce up as a warmer color. So lots of bounce lighting. Bounce lighting is always fun. And you can see it's starting to look more like metal now. It's not really just this sort of bluish thing. And the more highlights, the more bounce, the more attention to detail, the better it will look. Now you have to be careful when you do metals, because like I said, it's like a mirror, so it's going to reflect things that are nearby. So even though there's a bounce light, and just to fill you in right now, I'm just doing some bounce lighting on these little swirls and etchings here. Even though there is a bounce light and a strong overhead light, we have to keep in mind that there are highly reflective surfaces nearby with their own prismatic qualities, in this case gold. So some of the areas of the highly polished steel will have a golden bounce because there's gold nearby, and that's what it'd be reflecting. When I do metal, I try to think of it as if I was a computer, and if I was, like Maya or 3ds Max or something. I try to think of, okay, let's analyze each light source and make sure that it's represented as accurately as possible in each metallic or reflective surface. And it is a lot of work. It's a lot to think about. It takes time, but in my opinion, it's the only way to do it. So you can see that all the tentacles are going to get little bounce lights underneath now. And now the gauntlet gets it. And even the cloth gets a little bit of a bounce highlight. And even the Thunderhammer, which is a light source itself, gets some bounce highlight. And once again, this is a good way to show off textures. Just pick out your textures with the bounce. And here you get this nice sort of, this is obviously a metal because it has so many bounce reflections on it. On this chaos icon here. And, yeah, what was I doing here? Oh, right. I'm just doing a little bit of a bounce highlight on the brick itself. Alright, so now we're doing some gold color dodge. And this is a bounce highlight coming off of the gold objects. So anything that has a warm yellow light source or reflection will be reflected using gold. As you can see, it's worked its way into the scroll work on the gorget, the area around the flashlights, even some of the metal here, it's bouncing off the vambrace. And now we have gold reflecting onto other gold, getting a little bit of an exhibit meme going on here. And now we even need a green bounce because there is some reflection coming off of this green tabard onto the nearby metal elements. The bounce will always be brighter than the actual surface. That's why I tend to use color dodge. And now we need to reflect the fact that the overhead light source is warm and pink, so everything will get a little bit of a pinkish hue applied to it where the overhead light is hitting it. Lots of work. Alright, so now I'm fiddling. I'm using different layer types to try to get the right sort of look. I'm using saturation layers, I'm using lighten and darken layers, I'm using soft light to kind of universally lighten the image and add a little bit of a hue to it. I'm going in and I'm adding some more color dodge. I'm trying to get these tentacles to look like they're very reflective and sort of glistening. And not entirely natural. They're a little bit weird looking. They're sort of kind of icky and from another universe. Okay, so we've got all of our many different hues and light sources accounted for as we render. My goodness, there are a lot. Ugh, get out of your tentacle. That one really bothers me, the one behind him. Ugh. Okay, so we got some more of this sort of glow reflective deal coming off. Even the giant ship gets a little bit of love. And now we're using a exposure adjustment layer and an overlay adjustment layer and a saturation layer because we want to limit the saturation of the brightest light source. Things that are truly bright are actually quite unsaturated. Just because if something is true white, it's not going to have any color to it or any hue to it. Alright, so we're doing the contrails now using color burn layer. And another curves layer to adjust once more. A lot of the later stages just kind of finicky detailing of, well, is this quite right? Is this hue quite on mark? Is this a little bit too contrast? Is this too dark? Is this a little bit too bright? Stuff like that. It's really just sort of fixes. You know, is the atmospheric perspective here strong enough? Here I'm adding more bouncing light from behind him of just kind of atmospheric light, as well as we have some atmospheric perspective added to his clothing behind him. As you can see. And here we're doing just a little bit of bounce and rim, a little more defining of these tentacles. And same goes for the rest of the armor. Gotta do a little bit more bounce, atmospheric bounce. Okay, and now we're doing some aerial perspective on the top of the building as it fades away into the distance and is closer to the light source. The details are harder to make out and it starts to blend into the background a little bit. And some more atmospheric perspective. More, forever. atmospheric perspective is the best. It really helps add planes and depths and layers to your painting. See, adding just a light layer with some kind of pinkish color to add a little bit of depth between the rear leg and the foreleg, and then between the shield and the foreleg a little bit more. You know, it's making it pop out at you a little bit more. And even between the tentacles, the closer tentacles have some. Now we're doing just some kind of glows and hues to that magical portal. And lastly, or almost lastly, we're applying color layers, or hue layers to sort of give an overall chroma to the painting, a unifying color scheme, limiting the palette. And of course, we're doing more color dodge work with some blue around this Thunderhammer and Lightning. And just really making these jet exhausts kind of pop. They're really hot looking. I had the idea of doing this sort of eagle wing design on the bottoms. That'd be kind of like cast with glowing light, but it didn't end up looking cool as I was working on it, so I didn't finish it. I just thought it'd be too busy. It'd be too much of an eyesore. So I didn't take it to its full conclusion of having wings and feathers and all that crazy stuff. But it does look like it's on fire. I even toyed with the idea of having like a black hole there. Sort of like the light it's giving off is all the things that are being sucked into it, but it didn't look right at the end. It was just too much. And then I decided to differentiate the giant ship from the closer ships a little bit by adding clouds between them. Just a little bit. Most of them didn't stick around, but just a little bit. Oh, and if I remember correctly, I was watching Transformers 3 when I was working on this part. I think it was like 3 in the morning. Because, like I said, I just watch movies when I work sometimes, and quality does not matter so much because you're not really watching. You're really just, I don't know. It's to keep like your level of awake, your level of brain activity at a certain point. For me, I'm not really invested in the story, or I'm not really caring about what's going on. Maybe I'll stop to watch some of the explosions and Michael Bay stuff, but anyway. So here I'm adding some more smoke to the contrails, as well as doing little bits of highlighting to them. And some more glowing effects. This time using normal layers. Color dodges are great, but they tend to make things really pop and look unnatural. Using normal layers for highlighting is a little more subtle, a little more natural looking. It's kind of nice. So, and I also added these sort of mystical, magical wisps coming out of the tentacle bed, just sort of hinting at their supernatural nature. Yep. Polishing out the clouds a little bit. Some of them were still pretty rough from the original monochrome. And here I'm using a brightness and contrast layer, as well as a lighten layer with a blue. And some hard light layers to really make the headlights pop. And then some more hue layers to unify the color scheme throughout the painting. And lastly, it looks like a brightness and contrast layer. Just kidding, we're not done yet. Sometimes I like to work on things even when they're done. So here I'm using a lighten layer with some green. The thing is, when you paint greens and blues onto pinks, using lighten layers, it tends to desaturate them, and it's kind of it adds a little bit of the hue to it. So it's kind of cool because you get this effect like it's so intensely bright that the colors sort of goes away. So that's why that's there. I think this is lastly. I'm adding some debris floating through the air using my shrapnel brush, which is very easy to paint or make. And I just use a drop shadow and then invert it, so rather than darken it, lightens. And that's how I highlight all those little pieces of crap flying through the air. Okay, I think this is the last thing. Lastly, I went in and I bumped the contrast in the lightning by just sampling the area around it and painting in between the little rivulets of lightning, little tendrils of lightning reaching out, just to make it pop a little bit more. And we're done. So, thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave a comment. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.